There is a detail in Livy's history of the Second Punic War that most readers pass over without stopping. Livy, writing in Rome sometime around 25 BC, describes Hannibal Barca as the greatest general of his age. He catalogues the battles. He names the dead. He acknowledges, in his own words, that Rome came closer to total destruction during those 15 years than at any other point in the Republic's history. And then Livy writes something more remarkable still. He writes that the reason Rome survived was not because Hannibal was defeated in Italy. It was because Hannibal was never willing to march directly on the city. Think about what that sentence requires you to accept. Rome's own historian, writing in Latin in Rome for a Roman audience, under the patronage of the Emperor Augustus, is acknowledging that the man his civilization spent 2 centuries demonizing was never actually stopped in the field. He was diverted. He was outlasted. He was maneuvered away from the walls of a city he had the power to take. And then, when the war ended, the Romans wrote the history. You have been taught that Rome defeated Carthage. That is true. Rome did defeat Carthage, eventually, comprehensively, and with a finality that involved burning the city to the ground, salting the harbor, and executing or enslaving every surviving Carthaginian citizen. But between the beginning of that conflict and its end, there was a 15-year period during which a Carthaginian general fought inside Italy with no supply line, no reliable reinforcement, and no siege equipment, and never lost a single set-piece battle. How does a commander achieve that? How does a man fight for 15 years on the soil of his enemy, win every major engagement, and still become a footnote in the story of the civilization that survived him? And how did the version of events that reached every classroom in the Western world end up being written almost exclusively by the people he defeated? That is exactly what this video is about. You grew up in a world where the phrase "crossing the Alps" is practically synonymous with military audacity. You know the phrase. You may even know the name attached to it. But there is a difference between knowing a name and understanding what that name means. And the gap between those two things, in Hannibal's case, is where the real history lives. So let's start with what actually happened, not with the legend, with the facts. In the late autumn of the year 218 BC, a Carthaginian army descended from the Alps into the Po Valley in northern Italy. They had been marching for 5 months. They had crossed the Iberian Peninsula, forded the Rhone River under Roman pressure, and then done something that no organized military force in documented history had ever attempted. They had crossed the Alps in early winter with an army that included horses, supply wagons, and war elephants. The scholar John Lazenby, writing in his 1978 study Hannibal's War, estimated that Hannibal began that crossing with approximately 38,000 infantry, 8,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. He finished it with roughly 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a number of elephants reduced by cold, rockfall, and hostile mountain tribes to a figure that historians still debate. He had lost nearly half his army before setting foot in Italy, and within weeks of completing that crossing, he destroyed a Roman army at the Trebia River. Let that land for a moment. A general who had just lost half his force to frostbite and mountain warfare, who had no supply line, no fortress, no friendly territory, faced the most organized military machine on the Italian peninsula and won. Not barely, decisively. The historian Adrian Goldsworthy, writing in 2000, describes the Battle of the Trebia as a textbook demonstration of combined arms warfare 2 centuries before, the Roman legions would develop a comparable tactical vocabulary. Hannibal used the cold. He used the river. He used the psychological state of Roman commanders who had been told they were fighting a weakened, desperate force. And he used his cavalry in a way that Roman generals would spend the next 200 years trying to replicate. That was December. By June of the following year, he had destroyed another Roman army, this one at Lake Trasimene, in an ambush that killed the consul Gaius Flaminius and approximately 15,000 Roman soldiers in the space of 3 hours. The entire engagement took place in fog along a narrow road between hills and water, so efficiently designed that most of the Roman dead never saw who was killing them. It was not a battle. It was a geological trap. 2 battles, 2 Roman armies destroyed. No Carthaginian defeat. If you had studied at the military academy at St. Cyr in France, or at Sandhurst in Britain, or at West Point in the United States, you would have spent time studying what came next, not because of what Rome did, but because of what Hannibal did at a place called Cannae in the summer of 216 BC. What happened at Cannae is, by the consensus of military historians across cultures and centuries, the most perfectly executed tactical envelopment in the recorded history of warfare. The historian B.H. Liddell Hart, writing in the early 20th century, called it the foundational text of operational military thinking. Alfred von Schlieffen, the German field marshal who designed the war plan that Germany used to open World War I, modeled his entire strategic concept on Cannae. The battle was 2,000 years old by then. It was still the template. Before we get to Cannae, though, I want you to understand who Hannibal was before Italy, because the Alps crossing and the battles that followed were not the act of a man who improvised. They were the act of a man who had been preparing for this specific war for his entire life, and who had been trained to fight it by a father who understood that Carthage's survival required Rome's destruction. Carthage, at the beginning of the 3rd century BC, was not a peripheral civilization. It was a Phoenician colony-turned-empire that controlled the western Mediterranean basin, North Africa from modern-day Tunisia to Morocco, large sections of Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, and, until the First Punic War ended in 241 BC, most of Sicily. It was a commercial empire built on maritime trade. The historian Serge Lancel, writing in his 1995 biography of Hannibal, describes Carthage as the dominant naval power in the western Mediterranean for 3 centuries, with a merchant fleet and a navy that functioned as 2 arms of the same economic machine. The city itself, at its height, had a population estimated by ancient sources at between 400,000 and 700,000 people. It had a constitution, an elected senate, and a system of magistrates called suffets. It was, by every measure that matters, a sophisticated state. And then it lost the First Punic War, lost Sicily, lost Sardinia and Corsica in a subsequent extortion that the Romans themselves, in their own records, acknowledged was a violation of the peace treaty, lost the war indemnity payments that crippled Carthaginian finances for a generation, and lost something else, less quantifiable but more important. It lost the belief that accommodation with Rome was possible. Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, was the Carthaginian general who had prosecuted the final years of the First Punic War in Sicily. He had not been defeated in the field. He had been ordered to negotiate a surrender by a Carthaginian government that could no longer fund the war at sea. It was a distinction that defined the rest of his life. According to the Greek historian Polybius, whose account is the earliest and most contemporaneous source we have for this period, Hamilcar spent the years after 241 BC rebuilding Carthaginian power through the conquest of Spain. He took his son Hannibal with him, and before he left, if we believe the account that Polybius records from sources who knew the family, he asked Hannibal whether he wanted to come. Hannibal said yes. Hamilcar asked him to swear an oath before the gods that he would never be a friend to Rome. Hannibal was 9 years old. Picture this: a military camp on the coast of North Africa, sometime around 237 BC. A man who has spent 20 years fighting the most powerful republic on the Italian peninsula and lost, not in battle but in politics, in funding, in the exhaustion of a state that ran out of money before it ran out of soldiers. He is preparing to march west into Spain. He will spend the next decade turning the Iberian Peninsula into a Carthaginian military base, a revenue source, a recruiting ground, and he is taking his small son with him. He doesn't know his son will become the man history will call the greatest battlefield commander who ever lived. He only knows that the war is not over. It has simply moved. He needs someone to continue it. According to Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC from sources who had direct knowledge of Carthaginian affairs, Hamilcar looked at his son and said something close to, "You will have war with Rome if you come with me." And Hannibal said, "Take me." That is the origin of the Italian campaign. Not impulse, not opportunism. A 9-year-old's oath fulfilled. If you are finding that this version of the story is more specific, more human, and more politically complex than anything you were taught in school, that is not a coincidence, and I want to be precise about why. In 146 BC, 70 years after Hannibal's death, Rome completed its destruction of Carthage. The Third Punic War ended not with a battle, but with a siege that lasted 3 years, followed by the systematic demolition of one of the ancient world's great cities. The buildings were torn down. The harbor was blockaded. The surviving population, estimated by the classicist Adrian Goldsworthy at somewhere between 50,000 and 200,000 people, was killed or enslaved. The libraries were burned, not negligently, deliberately. The Roman Senate voted to give Carthage's book collections to the Numidian client kings, keeping only a single agricultural manual considered practically useful. Everything else was destroyed. Every Carthaginian account of the Punic Wars, every Carthaginian record of Hannibal's campaigns, every Carthaginian version of events, gone. What survived was Roman. Polybius, a Greek historian who was brought to Rome as a hostage and became a client of the Scipio family, the family of the Roman general who finally defeated Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. Livy, writing under Augustus, working from sources that had been filtered through generations of Roman literary tradition. Appian, a Greek writing in the 2nd century AD, all of them working from a position inside the civilization that had won. None of them had access to a Carthaginian archive, because there wasn't one anymore. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented historical reality. We know which buildings were burned. We know which libraries were catalogued and which were destroyed. We know that when Cicero visited Carthage a century later, he found a site of deliberate demolition, not natural ruin. The historian W.V. Harris, in his 1979 study, War and Imperialism in Republican Rome, documents the systematic nature of Roman destruction of enemy records and monuments throughout this period. The term he uses is not erasure, it's damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. It was a legal and military practice. So let's correct the record, not with Carthaginian sources, those are gone, but with what even the Roman sources read carefully reveal about a man they spent 2 centuries trying to diminish and couldn't quite manage to do. By the summer of 216 BC, Hannibal had been in Italy for 2 years. He had destroyed 2 Roman consular armies. He had wintered in the south, where his troops had recovered, resupplied from captured Roman stores, and been joined by some Italian allies who were beginning to wonder whether Roman dominance was as permanent as it had seemed. And the Roman Senate, after the disaster at Lake Trasimene, had appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, who pursued a strategy of deliberate non-engagement. Follow Hannibal, harass his foraging parties, never fight him in open battle, wait. The Romans called this strategy after Fabius himself, Fabian tactics. They have been used in every century since, by George Washington in the American Revolution, by Mao Zedong in the Chinese Civil War, by every insurgent commander who ever faced a superior force and chose attrition over confrontation. It was a sound strategy. It was also politically intolerable. 2 Roman armies had been destroyed. The Italian allies were watching. The Senate was under pressure from the popular assembly and from commercial interests who were losing money, while Hannibal moved through the most productive agricultural regions of Italy, eating their grain. So Rome replaced Fabius with 2 new consuls, raised the largest army in the Republic's history to that point, and marched south to find Hannibal and end this. The army that met Hannibal at Cannae on August 2nd, 216 BC, numbered, by Polybius's count, 86,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry. Hannibal had approximately 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry. The Romans had chosen a flat, open plain on the banks of the Aufidus River, the kind of terrain where, in every previous battle in Roman history, numerical superiority had been decisive. Press forward, mass the center, overwhelm. Hannibal knew this. He had fought Rome for 2 years. He understood their tactical doctrine at the unit level, and he designed Cannae specifically to use that doctrine against itself. Picture this: the morning of August 2nd, on a dusty plain in Apulia. Tens of thousands of men assembled in battle lines on both sides. On the Roman side, the consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro are looking at numbers that should be reassuring. They have more men, they have more infantry, they have a flat plain with no tricks of terrain. On the Carthaginian side, Hannibal is deploying his line in a shape that Roman commanders, looking at it, might have read as weakness. His center, made up of his Spanish and Gallic allies, troops of lower quality than his African veterans, is bulging forward toward the Roman line in a convex arc. His best troops, his African heavy infantry, are on both flanks, set back. His cavalry, which substantially outnumbers the Roman cavalry on both wings, is positioned to sweep. The Roman consuls ordered the advance. The lines closed. The center held for a while. Then it began to bend. The Gallic and Spanish infantry in Hannibal's bulging center gave ground, not in a rout, but deliberately, in a controlled retreat that the Romans read as success. The Roman infantry pressed forward into the retreating center, packing tighter as the wings squeezed inward, until the 86,000-man Roman army had compressed itself into a mass so dense that men in the middle could barely raise their weapons. And then the African veterans on both flanks wheeled inward, and the Carthaginian cavalry, having routed the Roman cavalry on both wings, came around the Roman rear. The Romans were surrounded completely on every side. Polybius records that approximately 70,000 Roman soldiers died at Cannae in a single afternoon. Modern estimates from archaeologists who have excavated the site range from 50,000 to 70,000. The consul Aemilius Paulus was killed. 80 senators were among the dead. More Roman citizens died at Cannae in one day than American soldiers died in the entire Vietnam War. The battle lasted less than 6 hours. What Hannibal had done at Cannae was not new in principle. The idea of envelopment, surrounding an enemy rather than meeting them frontally, had existed in military thinking before 216 BC. What was new was the precision of execution. Hannibal had coordinated infantry, cavalry, and a deliberate tactical deception across a front of several miles, in real time, without modern communications, in such a way that every component moved at the correct moment to produce a perfect encirclement. The military historian Theodore Dodge, writing in his 1891 biography of Hannibal, called it the most perfect battle ever fought. He meant it as an analytical statement, not hyperbole. After Cannae, 16 Italian cities defected from Rome's alliance. The city of Capua, the second largest city in Italy, opened its gates to Hannibal. Syracuse, Rome's ally in Sicily, reconsidered its loyalty. Philip V of Macedon sent ambassadors to discuss an alliance. Hannibal, standing in the ruins of 3 Roman armies, with the largest Carthaginian force ever assembled on Italian soil, seemed to be on the edge of something that historians spend careers arguing about: the end of Rome. He did not march on the city. This is the moment that Roman historians, and many modern ones, have used to construct their preferred narrative of the Second Punic War, Hannibal's failure to advance on Rome after Cannae, as evidence of strategic error, timidity, or limited vision. Livy's account implies that the decision cost Carthage the war. The Roman general Maharbal, one of Hannibal's cavalry commanders, supposedly said to him after Cannae, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal. You do not know how to use one." That line appears in Livy. Livy, writing in Rome under Augustus, 200 years after Cannae. The classicist Dexter Hoyos, in his 2003 study, Hannibal's Dynasty, argues that the Maharbal quote is almost certainly a literary invention, a retrospective explanation for an outcome the Romans needed to make sense of. Because the alternative, that Hannibal made a rational strategic calculation and Rome survived, not because of a Carthaginian mistake but because of Roman institutional resilience, was a more complicated story. More true, but more complicated. What strikes me about this is not the quote itself. It's that the quote has been cited by historians for 2,000 years as evidence of Hannibal's strategic failure. And almost no one pauses to note that it comes from a source written 2 centuries after the fact, in the language of the civilization that needed him to have made a mistake. Here is what the evidence actually supports. After Cannae, Hannibal did not have siege equipment capable of reducing a city the size of Rome. His army was exhausted. His supply situation, never stable, was becoming critical. Carthage had not sent the reinforcements he had been requesting since the Alps crossing. His brother Hasdrubal was pinned in Spain by the Roman generals Gnaeus and Publius Scipio. And Rome, despite having just lost 70,000 men in a single afternoon, was doing something that Hannibal had no precedent for. It was not negotiating. Every other civilization Rome had defeated had, at some point, sent ambassadors to discuss terms. After Cannae, the Roman Senate refused to ransom prisoners. It refused to receive Carthaginian envoys. It raised new legions. It conscripted slaves. It sent its army to Spain to cut Hannibal's supply route. The Roman historian Polybius, who is the most reliable source we have for this period, records the Senate's response to Cannae with something approaching awe. Not Roman propaganda, but documented astonishment from a Greek historian who had studied warfare across the Mediterranean. Rome should have broken. It didn't. Hannibal spent 11 more years in Italy. He never lost a battle. He also never received adequate reinforcement. The Carthaginian Senate, dominated by a faction led by Hanno the Elder, who had opposed the Italian campaign from the beginning, repeatedly underfunded the Italian theater. Hasdrubal eventually crossed the Alps in 207 BC with a relief force, but was defeated and killed at the Battle of the Metaurus River before reaching Hannibal. The first Hannibal knew of his brother's death was when Roman soldiers threw Hasdrubal's severed head into his camp. That detail appears in Livy. Livy uses it to mark the turning point, the moment when Hannibal understood the war was unwinnable. And for once, even a Roman source is recording something that reads as unambiguously human. A general who had crossed mountains, destroyed armies, and spent 15 years fighting the most powerful republic in the Mediterranean world, looking at his dead brother's head. He stayed in the south of Italy for 4 more years. When Scipio Africanus invaded North Africa in 204 BC, threatening Carthage itself, Hannibal was finally recalled. He crossed the Mediterranean, assembled an army of veterans and newly conscripted troops, and faced Scipio at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. He lost. The battle at Zama is the only major engagement in the Italian or African campaign in which Hannibal was definitively defeated in the field. Polybius credits Scipio with adapting the tactical lessons of Cannae, specifically the use of cavalry on both flanks, and using them against Hannibal himself. It was, in some sense, the most honest tribute Rome ever paid him. They had to become him, to beat him. After Zama, the peace terms imposed on Carthage stripped it of its navy, its overseas territories, and its right to make war without Roman permission. Hannibal remained in Carthage as its leading politician for several years, attempting to reform its finances and governance. When Rome demanded his extradition on the grounds that he was rebuilding Carthaginian strength, he fled. He spent the rest of his life in the courts of Eastern Mediterranean rulers, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, Prusias of Bithynia, advising, organizing, is still attempting to construct a coalition that might threaten Rome. When Prusias agreed to hand him over to Roman envoys, Hannibal took poison. He was 64 years old. The historian Serge Lancel, in his 1995 biography, notes that Hannibal died in exile in Asia Minor, a man without a country. Carthage had already surrendered. His property had been confiscated. His political career had ended. But he died without being captured, without being paraded through Rome in chains, without providing the Roman triumph that the Senate had wanted since 218 BC. It was, in the context of his life, a characteristic exit, denied to them at the end, the same way he had denied them victory for 15 years in Italy. The erasure of Hannibal's true significance did not happen overnight, and it was not simple censorship. It was more sophisticated than that. The record that survived was Roman, but it was a record that acknowledged his military genius while systematically redirecting the narrative toward Roman resilience. Livy praises Hannibal's tactical brilliance in the same breath that he describes Roman virtue as the ultimate counterweight. Polybius, more rigorous and more honest, comes closer to the actual record, but Polybius wrote as a client of the Scipio family. Even the most reliable source we have came from inside the court of the family that defeated him. What the Roman literary tradition could not quite bury, because it was too well documented, too visible in too many separate accounts, was the operational record. The Alps, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. 16 years without a battlefield loss in Italy, and these were facts that even a hostile tradition couldn't erase, because too many Romans had witnessed them, recorded them, written letters home about them, described them in memoirs. The dead were real, the defeats were real. The Roman tradition managed this by surrounding the facts with a narrative frame. Yes, Hannibal was brilliant, but Rome was eternal. The outcome was inevitable. The outcome was not inevitable. I want to be precise about what I mean. I am not arguing that Hannibal would have won the Second Punic War under different circumstances. Historical counterfactuals are not the territory of this channel. What I am saying is this: the framing of Hannibal as a man who won battles but lost the war, as a genius whose campaign was ultimately futile, is not a neutral historical assessment. It is a Roman conclusion, drawn by Roman writers, serving a Roman narrative purpose. It required them to emphasize Zama and minimize the 15 years before it. It required them to present Hannibal's strategic decisions after Cannae as failures, rather than as rational responses to a supply situation that Carthage had refused to resolve. It required them to write the ending and call it the meaning. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BC completed what the literary framing had started. There were no Carthaginian archives left to challenge the Roman account. The libraries burned, the manuscripts burned, the city burned, and the version of the Second Punic War that survived was the one that Roman writers, with Roman patrons writing in Latin, chose to preserve. Today, Hannibal's name survives, but in a particular shape: the Alps crossing as adventure, Cannae as tactical curiosity, the overall narrative as Rome's eventual, inevitable triumph. Military academies study Cannae as a masterpiece of encirclement, but the context, that the man who designed it spent 15 more years undefeated in Italy and never received the support he needed, rarely features in the lesson. The tactical genius is taught. The political story is not. What that political story actually reveals is something that cuts well beyond the Second Punic War. Hannibal's campaign exposed a structural question that Rome's historians needed to answer without quite answering it. What does it mean when a civilization survives, not because it was militarily superior, but because it was institutionally indestructible? Rome lost every major battle in Italy for 15 years. It replaced armies. It replaced consuls. It passed emergency legislation. It conscripted classes of citizens who had never been expected to fight. And it kept going, not through genius, but through the kind of collective refusal to accept defeat that no single commander, however brilliant, can overcome with cavalry and tactics. That is a genuinely interesting answer to Hannibal's campaign. It is an honest answer, but it is an answer that required Rome's historians to tell a specific kind of story, one in which Carthage's failure was Hannibal's failure, not the failure of a Carthaginian senate that refused to reinforce a winning general, one in which Zama was the meaning of the war, not an epilogue to a 15-year stalemate, one in which the history of the conflict was preserved in Latin, in Rome, and nowhere else. And the consequences of that historiographic choice echo in ways that are still visible. Hannibal is studied as a military technician, his battles diagrammed in textbooks, his encirclement at Cannae reproduced on acetates and digital slides in war colleges from Carlisle to Paris. But the political and civilizational context of his campaign, the fact that he was fighting to preserve a non-Roman, Semitic-speaking North African civilization against a Roman imperial project that would eventually consume the entire Mediterranean world, rarely enters the curriculum. The tactics are taught without the stakes. The general is taught without the civilization he was defending. Carthage had 700 years of history when Rome destroyed it. It had produced mathematicians, navigators, agricultural scientists, and one of the ancient world's most sophisticated constitutions. Aristotle, in his Politics, wrote that the Carthaginian constitution was one of 3 governments worthy of serious study, alongside Sparta and Crete. He was not writing propaganda. He was making a comparative political judgment. That civilization, its archives, its scholarship, its material culture, its account of its own history, does not exist anymore, because Rome burned it. What survives is the shape of the absence. We know Carthage existed because Rome described it. We know Hannibal's battles through Roman accounts. We know the Second Punic War because Polybius and Livy and Appian wrote it down, and because Polybius, at least, was rigorous enough that his account contains the data even a hostile reading reveals. The man who crossed the Alps in winter. The man who killed 70,000 Romans in an afternoon. The man who spent 15 years on Italian soil without losing a battle, fighting a war that Carthage was unwilling to win and Rome was unwilling to lose. The history books were written by the men he defeated. He gave them a great deal to write about. The question that has echoed across military history for 2,000 years, whether Hannibal could have taken Rome after Cannae, whether a different decision in August of 216 BC would have produced a different world, is the wrong question. The right question is simpler and harder. What does it mean that we have spent 2,000 years asking it in Latin? If you've watched this far, leave a comment. Tell me which part of this story you were never taught. Tell me which battle changed the way you think about this. The comments on this channel are part of the archive. They are part of the correction. The next video on this channel is about a commander who won every battle for 30 years across 3 continents, and whose name you almost certainly cannot spell. That story is coming. Every account of Hannibal was written by Rome. He still nearly won.